If you've ever been to the beach, and sometimes the waves will come up and create a little divot on the sand, a little pool of water. Sometimes a fish will get caught in that pool. When I discovered the Orthodox Church and historic Christianity, what it felt like, my entire life up until that point, I had been that fish in that little, tiny little pool of water about 50 yards away from the ocean.
I remember someone saying to me, close to the time of my entering into the church, there will be a day when we will stand in front of the mirror and smile and say, "Thank God I'm an Orthodox Christian." And I did.
In my journey, it's been a discovery of myself and through the course of finding orthodoxy, but specifically in the Western Rite, it's reappropriating what was rightly part of the church and the beauty of the church's diversity, unity and diversity.
So I had a wonderful upbringing, terrific parents. I was raised in a typical evangelical home, raised Southern Baptist. I guess it wasn't completely typical. We weren't really as fundamentalist as a lot of Southern Baptists are. My dad made wine, smoked cigars, and defended Mother Teresa in Sunday school. He was raised Italian Catholic. But at any rate, we were a little more open-minded. But I had a wonderful upbringing, very serious about my faith. When I was about 18 years old, I came to a crossroads in my life where that serious, the love for Christ really, it went to a new level, and I really felt I wanted to serve God and His church. About that time, I remember a question occurred to me, just out of nowhere, popped into my head. And so I went to my Baptist pastor to ask him the question. We were very close. I trusted him. I said, what did the early church look like? I'll never forget what he told me. And to this day, I don't know why he told me this, because I've come to find out it's quite different than what he said. He said, "We have no idea." I thought, this can't be. We must know something. So I began to do a little research on my own. I started reading some things. And I began to discover that the church was liturgical, always liturgical. I mean, the church was a Jewish sect. I mean, this was earth-shattering to this Baptist boy. I mean, Baptists didn't ask this question. I don't know if it was ever said outright, but we just had this feeling, it was assumed that the early Christians in the first centuries, that they looked like we did. They looked like the Baptists, like our Wednesday night Bible studies. Within a year, by the time I was 19, as things transpired in my life, I ended up leaving the Baptist church on good terms and helped to plant a small church in Virginia. And this was a group of people who were like-minded, and they were all asking the same question about historic Christianity. They were searching for something more.
By the time of my senior year at the University of Missouri, I was a philosophy major who had specialized in Asian religion and philosophy. And I had no idea what I was going to do when I graduated. I wasn't part of anything at that point religiously. Subsequent to that, through one thing or another, I began to read the Bible again. And reading through the Gospel of John, I was apprehended, one might say, by God. I was convinced that Jesus was the Son of God, the Messiah, and that that's where I needed to head. I ended up going through confirmation classes at the local Episcopal church and was off to seminary in September following my graduation after our marriage. The Episcopal church that I entered was one thing. The Episcopal church, as I went to seminary, was beginning to change rapidly. The talk about women's ordination, ended up with an illegal ordination of 11 women in Philadelphia, which was 1974, I believe. They were establishing a new prayer book for the church, going through lots of trial usage, and everything was changing. I went to Alaska and took an interim term, it was called, and spent a year there working for the Bishop of Alaska in a small Eskimo village 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle, Point Hope, Alaska. And spent that time, I read through the Bible 3 times over that year. There was a lot of time to read. And the decision was made between the two of us that I should finish seminary. If I needed to make a decision after that, fine, but at least I'd have my MDiv. And so I spent the next 9 years after my ordination on what I would call islands of small O orthodoxy within the Episcopal Church, parishes that were clinging to the traditional faith. And but after 9 years, I realized that those were shrinking, and that you didn't want to be on an island in a church that was swimming rapidly from what I considered over the waterfall. So that's when I renounced my ministry.
I grew up as a son of a Methodist pastor. My father, the late Reverend Ken Hammer. I was the second of 5 boys. Grew up primarily here in Frederick County. My dad was assigned for 2 years out in western Maryland in the little town of Mount Savage, and then in 1969 we moved to Thurmont, where my dad spent the remaining years of his ministry. And I started first grade there and graduated high school here in Thurmont, so I really consider this my hometown. Following my graduation from high school in 1981, I went off to school at the University of Maryland to study engineering. And after completing 4 years, I started working as a student police aide, and I became very interested in law enforcement. So much so that I told my parents that I was leaving my engineering studies in order to go to the police academy. I had been offered a position with the University of Maryland Police, which is a career that I have followed now for 32 years. Around 93, my dad had asked me to become the lay leader there at the church. We were very actively involved, even though we were traveling a good distance. We were at a picnic at Eilers Valley Chapel. We would normally have a picnic there once a month during the summer. And a woman by the name of Margot Hall, following our picnic, came over to me, and she said to me, I believe the Lord has directed me to tell you that you are to go to seminary and you're to go into the ministry. James being the English rendering of the word Jacob, I spent much of my adult life wrestling God and running away from this call into ordained ministry. So it was not until much later that I finally quit wrestling with God and submitted to the call and began a process to become certified as a candidate for ordained ministry.
On the anniversary of my ordination to the priesthood, I was in the bishop's office in Eau Claire, renouncing my ministry in the Episcopal Church.
But then the question was, what were we going to do afterwards? I grabbed a copy of the Orthodox Church and the Orthodox Way, and I had read those and thought, this is what he'll want to do. And when it came to the moment, I said, so are we going to go Orthodox? And he was, no, we're not going to go Orthodox. And then because of his feelings of frustration and anger with the Episcopal Church in general, organized bureaucracies, these kinds of things, he was done for a while. It was odd for me because I had always gone to church on Sunday morning. This is what the family did. And now all of a sudden we were sleeping late on Sunday. We were one of those families that did that. And then Dad puts the kids in the wagon and they walk up to the grocery store, they pick up the Sunday paper, come home with a bag of donuts, everybody just kicks back, and it was very strange and very unfulfilling.
After having some time to heal from my resentment and anger and realizing that what the Episcopal Church was doing was not personally directed at me, it was actually at my father's funeral in 1989 that my uncle said, "What are you doing? You need to get back in the church." I got in touch with a bishop I knew that was in part of the continuing Anglican Church and was assigned to a church in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and was making my confession to the Greek Orthodox priest in Cheyenne, who told me after a while, "You know, you're Orthodox already in your heart. You should be in the Orthodox Church." I went to a conference in Denver, a Western Rite conference, and it was really my first awakening to the fact that there was a Western Rite in Orthodoxy. I met several of the clergy. I had a wonderful meeting with Bishop Basil, and looked like this would be the way to go. Unfortunately, the parish I was in was not going to become Orthodox, and at that point in time, that was the way you came into the church. You brought a parish. So Bishop Basil said, "Well, just wait. We'll see what happens." I was subsequently elected, much to my reluctance, bishop of the group we were in, and there was a conflict within the diocese with the larger group we were with over an issue, and many of the parishes in that diocese, in fact, the majority of the parishes, decided, being Southern, that they would secede from the group they were with. This was one of the problems with the continuing Anglican Church. And they asked me to continue to be their bishop. I said, you know, it doesn't work that way. But they persuaded me, and I said, the only way I will do this is if over the next 18 months to 2 years, we find a permanent home. We can't be out here on our own. One of the options that I presented to the diocese was Antiochian Western Rite. Father Michael Kaiser agreed that he would come around to all of our parishes and talk to them, answer questions, whatever they had, and that looked good to me. But by the time of our synod in, I believe it was either August or September of 2005, it was clear that the diocese was not going to do anything. They wanted to remain the way they were. And I said, all right, if that's the case, I'm handing off the mitre, and we are going to become Orthodox.
After 10 years of Christian studies, I discovered Timothy Ware. I read his book, The Orthodox Church. Reading Timothy Ware made me realize that in my heart and soul, theologically, I was Orthodox. And I don't know what to do with that. My top obstacle was that I had already been ordained a priest in the Charismatic Episcopal Church, and in late 2005, we had started the mission here that eventually became St. John the Baptist. At that time, we were called Lamb of God Charismatic Episcopal Church. So I had a new church family. I was a newly ordained priest trying to grow this mission. 4 years later at a clergy meeting, I heard a presentation by Father Patrick Cardine, Father Alban Wagner on Orthodoxy and the Western Rite specifically. Father Patrick Cardine, who had been within our diocese in the CEC, was already in the Orthodox Church at that time. So he ended up getting permission for himself and Father Alban Wagner to come up and to give a presentation And as a result of hearing that presentation, I knew in my heart and soul this is where God was calling me to be. And it was just a matter of my family and then our congregation really confirming that call.
In 1989, I remember it was late. It was about 11 p.m. and my wife was there sitting on the couch reading a book. And I was bored. So one of my favorite pastimes is to annoy my wife. So I thought I'm just going to bother her and see if I get a reaction. So I grabbed a book off the shelf. I didn't even look. Just reached up, grabbed a book off the shelf, and I opened it up and started reading. I said, no, you need to read something worth reading. Listen to this. So I'm reading through, and she finally, after a few minutes, says, I'm going to bed. So she goes to bed. Strangest thing was, I couldn't put the book down. I was completely captivated by what I was reading. So I backed up into my chair, never shut the book, sat down, and I read straight through the night. I read the whole book, beginning to end, to the wee hours of the morning. And the book was Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. I was so captivated by what I was reading, the ideas, the theology, the philosophy that I was reading in there, and this reference to this church and orthodoxy. And I began to think, this is what I'm looking for. I think this is what I'm looking for. I was convinced that this was the church. Totally convinced. Just by intuition, and it just resonated. And I said, I've got to find out more about this Orthodox Church. So I looked up local churches. I would go visit. I found a monastery. I would go to Vespers every Saturday night. I would talk to the monks. I'd talk to the abbot. I still know him to this day. And yet there was still this one stumbling block. There was an obstacle that I could not seem to get past. I could not resolve the Orthodox Church's claim to be the Catholic Church, the Catholic faith, the Orthodox Catholic Church, the universal apostolic church for all peoples in all times, in all places. I could not resolve that claim with what appeared to me, from the outside of course, but what appeared to me to be a disregard for anything that was not Greek or Byzantine or Slavic or Eastern. Well, I just eventually realized that the Orthodox Church in the West, as a mission church, this is just the way it was. It wasn't right, but over 1,000 years of having lost this Western expression of her tradition, she just began to identify as Eastern. Once I accepted the reality of it, my stumbling block was removed. And I wasn't trying to explain it away. I think that's the key. All the priests I were asking, instead of them saying to me, yes, this is the way it is, and it's not right, they were trying to give an apologetic for the reason it was this way.
For me, the restoration of the Western Rite to Orthodoxy is the culmination of everything I believed my spiritual home should have been. The English expression of the Orthodox Church in the first millennium. This is the restoration of that English spirituality to Orthodoxy as it was for those first 1,000 years. That to me, that heritage of those great Celtic saints, St. Columba, St. Cuthbert, St. Patrick, all of them, is That is my Christianity. And for me to be able to live that out now as part of the Orthodox Church, instead of sort of playing at it as an Anglican and doing my own thing, is very important to me. Between Antioch and Rocor, the Western Rite is being restored. It is the true home for all of those who are like-minded about their cultural heritage, their cultural spiritual heritage. This is their home. This is where Anglicans really need to return. But interestingly, in Lynchburg, most of our converts come from a Baptist background. So their heritage is a little different. It's the more reformed expression of English Christianity, post-Reformations. But it's also a home for them. When we came into the church, Bishop Thomas, our diocesan, was our primary bishop and has been extremely supportive. A few years ago, Bishop John was made the vicar bishop for all of the Western Rite parishes, so he is our primary bishop now, and also obviously extremely supportive. We've experienced some opposition, mostly here at Holy Trinity, from the evangelical parents of our converts. My advice to them is let your witness win them over. Other opposition, ironically, has come from the Orthodox parents of some of the young couples that I've married, who, being completely ignorant of the Western Rite, being from other jurisdictions, don't quite know what we are. They aren't sure we're Orthodox. And so they, again, they need to be won over by the example of their children. And I don't usually get much of an opportunity to speak with them. So it's going to be their children that'll win them over to the orthodoxy of the Western Rite. I believe the Western Rite can be, as Metropolitan Anthony Bashir envisioned it, a great evangelistic tool for America, a great missionary tool. We need to be more forthright in that. I think we could be establishing congregations everywhere. Obviously, we don't want to encroach on already established Orthodox parishes, but in many cases, like here in Lynchburg, they're rather moribund. So it's good to bring the life in Christ that exists within the church to Lynchburg. We are seeking to convert those who do not know Christ to the Lord Jesus Christ. Primarily, that's our function. Those who are already Christian, we are trying to introduce to the fullness of the apostolic faith and give them an opportunity to experience what the church was like when the church was one. The Western Rite is valid to me primarily because this is what the Orthodox Church looked like in those first 1,000 years. There was a Western expression of orthodoxy that was accepted by everyone as orthodox. No one had any question about the orthodoxy. The fact of the matter is that Rome was the place of appeal primarily because so many of the heresies that affected the eastern part of the church were not present in Rome. And the East would often appeal to Rome to deal with heresy. So Rome was always viewed as an extremely Orthodox patriarchate, at least for those first 800 years, let us say. At that point, things began to shift, and we had this long period over which we call the schism came into being. Probably a period of at least 400 years for the schism. Everybody dates it from 1054. That's pretty artificial, but it was a long-term process of the separation of East and West. St. John of Shanghai and San Francisco made the statement that don't let anyone ever tell you that in order to be Orthodox, you have to be Eastern. The church in the West was Orthodox for 1,000 years.
After we told Bishop Thomas that we wanted to become Orthodox, one of the things that Bishop Thomas asked us to do was to evaluate both the Eastern Rite and the Western Rite. We were obedient to what Bishop Thomas told us. If he had told us that we were going to become Eastern Rite, we would have been happy to be Eastern Rite, just to be in the Orthodox faith. That was the most important thing. I discovered really 5 things that were important about becoming Western Rite, not just a personal preference, but really 5 important reasons. We believe that being in an area in which we have people of Roman Catholic and various Protestant denominations, that becoming Western Rite would provide us the best opportunity to draw others in this area to the Orthodox faith. For the first 1,000 years of the Church, the Orthodox Church was both Latin West and Byzantine Greek East. And that diversity was expressed from the British Isles all the way into the Middle East. When Rome fell out of communion with the Orthodox Church, for 1,000 years, the Western Rite disappeared with that schism. It is a reappropriation of what was rightly the Church's for 1,000 years. About the time I became Orthodox, through a DNA study, I found out that I was a descendant of Neil the Nine Hostages. It was an ancient Irish king. But what's important there is he was the great-great-grandfather of St. Columba. So I have an actual ancestral DNA connection to an Irish saint. My wife and I, most recently, in celebrating our 30th wedding anniversary, had the opportunity to go to Ireland, and in visiting some of the tombs of these saints and venerating their relics, I recognize the fact that there is a spiritual connection, not only for me, but for many Western people, particularly as the Irish saints helped to preserve Western Christianity through the period of the Dark Ages. So for 1,000 years, as the West, the Latin West, was part of the Orthodox Church, there were prayers, there were such as the breastplate of St. Patrick. These are all part and expressions of Western Orthodoxy. In Holy Orthodoxy, the Western Rite and the Eastern Rite are both beautiful and valid expressions of Orthodoxy. This is the glory of the Church, this rich tapestry of the faith expressed. And we have this opportunity to bring back the Western Rite as a part of that tapestry.
So I called an Orthodox priest that I knew had been on a very similar journey to ours. So he said, the bishop of your diocese, where you would be, he's going to be at this conference center in Pennsylvania. So we drove up to the conference center, and we went into the cafeteria, and there he was sitting there having lunch. And honest to God, this is what happened. I walked up to Bishop Thomas and I said, Your Grace, I'm not here kicking tires. I am banging on the door I want in the church. And God bless Bishop Thomas, he doesn't let any grass grow under his feet. He said to one of the priests, he said, come over here. I want to start getting these people catechized right away. And he asked me, he said, have you thought about whether you want to be Western Rite or Eastern Rite? I did tell him, I said, we've talked a little bit about it because we didn't know. We'll do whatever you tell us to do, though. He said, well, I want you to go out and visit some Orthodox churches as a community. After a lot of soul searching, we really felt like God was calling us to enter the Western Rite. People ask me, why'd you become Western Rite? And I tell them, I mean, I hope I don't offend them, and I'm not talking about anybody else's story. This was from where we were coming from. But I said I became Western Rite because it was the most Orthodox thing I could do. And The funny thing is, initially I didn't want to be Western Rite. I mean, I grew up Baptist. I didn't have any, I wasn't Anglican or Roman Catholic. I had no liturgical sacramental tradition that I felt emotionally connected with. I had spent 20 years visiting Eastern Rite churches. I loved the Byzantine liturgy. I embraced it. It was beautiful, full of life. I loved it. So when we came into the church, I would have to say I probably at that time preferred the Eastern Rite a little bit. But it wasn't about preference. It was about the opportunity to express and embrace the fullness of the Orthodox faith. It was about me being in my cell. With all that I've shared about Catholicity and that stumbling block, here I had an opportunity to embrace and express the Catholicity of the Orthodox Church in the West, with a great heart and zeal for seeing the West become Orthodox again. Father George Florovsky said, "You cannot have a true patristic synthesis if you do not include the Latin Fathers and the Western liturgical tradition." I had read the Desert Fathers a lot since I was a kid. And one of the things that they taught that stuck with me was, if you can't find Christ in your cell, you can't find him anywhere. And of course, the monastics were having trouble with people roving around and running here and running there, and they were taught to stay put, by and large. And that's, of course, why I love Benedictine spirituality, too, because one of the main platforms or vows is stability. Stay put. Find Christ here. And my cell is the West. If I go into some exotic experience to find Christ, I was afraid that I would deceive myself into thinking that I was holy. Some Orthodox folks today have this idea that somehow in the Western Church, from the very beginning, there was some seed of corruption there. You have to reject St. Gregory the Great, the Dialogus. You have to reject all these saints. You probably have to reject the Fourth Ecumenical Council. It seems as if we should try and live as if there was no sin, no schism, as if it never happened, like innocently. And if I was to do that, if I was to live as if there had been no schism, then I would be serving the liturgy of St. Gregory the Great, living in Virginia. That's just what would have happened. So it seemed like the natural thing to do. If a mother had a little baby, and by some tragic event that baby was taken and stolen away, abducted, and lost to that poor mother, and many, many decades later, a grown woman comes up to that mother who lost her baby and said, "Mom, I'm your child. I've been searching for you and I found you. I've come back to you." That's what's happening to us now. This great, rich, beautiful, spirit-breathed tradition of our fathers, of our body, our very body, is being restored to us. It's important to our mission, the mission that was given to us at Pentecost, that this is the church for all people, in all places, at all times. This is the fullness of the faith, and it has to include the whole body, the whole tradition, everything that we have received from the apostles, all of it.